When the United States and Iran made their first nuclear deal, Europe played a really big part. It was Europe under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that included the EU, Germany, and France, as well as the UK. They were part of this effort to bring Iran and the United States together along with China and Russia and created this big nuclear deal that not only put limits on Iran's nuclear program, but also Europe's biggest diplomatic achievement at that point, a sign to the world that, Europe, after struggling to create the European Union and aligning its policies, was capable of being a diplomatic power. But this time, now that Iran and the US are hurtling towards a new crisis, on the verge of a possible another round of war between the United States and Iran, Europe is missing in action. It's nowhere to be found. I'm Borzu Deragahi. I'm a longtime journalist and the writer of the newsletter Badlands. It's at borzu.substack.com. Please subscribe, become a paying subscriber if you like. Today I wanted to chat a little bit about Europe's role, or rather non-role, in the current crisis and ahead of a possible attack, ongoing diplomacy in Oman involving the Arab countries, including Saudi Arabia and Egypt. UAE is possibly also involved. Turkey is heavily involved. Regional countries like Pakistan are also trying to make sure that there is no conflict. Meanwhile, Europe is nowhere to be found. It's making statements occasionally. Its one big achievement was designating the Revolutionary Guard a terrorist organization. After Iran's really horrible crackdown on protesters in the country in early January, at least 7,000 people were killed, according to human rights organizations, in that violence. And this was kind of a mistake because it not only does really little in terms of damaging or hurting the Islamic Republic, it creates a situation where really the Europeans have no leverage over Iran at this point. Some analysts are saying that Iran has become such a problem, such a headache for the Europeans, that they basically don't want to engage anymore. That's also a mistake, because without the European involvement, without the Europeans putting some pressure on the Trump administration, putting some pressure on Iran, the danger is that there will be a war. And Europe seems to be kind of blind to that fact. And there are some leaders in Europe even kind of cheering on the possibility that there will be a conflict between the US and Iran, hoping that it will lead to regime change. But what if it doesn't lead to regime change? And what if it leads to regime collapse? Guess who pays the price for that? Guess who paid the price for the crisis in Syria and Iraq and Libya? When millions of people were displaced in those conflicts, where did they head to? They didn't head to America. They didn't head to the Middle East. They headed to Turkey and then to Europe. They headed to Europe. The European Union, by not trying to put the brakes on the rush towards armed conflict, it's taking a big risk that it will pay the price for. It's not going to be the United States. That's in Syria, 1/3 of the population was displaced, about 8 million people during that conflict. And about maybe 1/3 of those people, maybe a little bit more, ended up trying to head outside of Syria and outside of the Middle East. If the same kind of thing that happened in Syria or Libya or Yemen were to happen in Iran, like a regime collapse, civil war, and so on, we're talking about 31 million people potentially displaced, proportionally speaking. Millions of people pining to get into Europe to get away from this war. That is going to be very destabilizing to Europe. This is one of the main reasons why the regional powers, the regional countries are opposed to this war, even though they don't like the Islamic regime. They don't trust the US to do anything good for the Iranian people or the region, and Europeans shouldn't either. There seems to be some kind of weird acquiescence to whatever the Trump administration wants to do on Iran. You saw that in this weird message that Macron sent to Trump, that Trump leaked right around the time of the World Economic Forum, in which Emmanuel Macron, the French president, was saying basically, we can do good things on Iran. Emmanuel Macron was basically saying, hey, what's all this Greenland talk? We'll give you your war in Iran if you just let off on Greenland. I've spoken to some people in officialdom in France, for example, and they've basically said, hey, aren't you proud of us that we designated the Revolutionary Guard a terrorist organization. The U.S. did that years ago, and it didn't seem to impact the regime one iota. And it also didn't create any space for negotiation. The Europeans are basically taking themselves out of the game of an important situation and an important potential crisis that will impact them. Once again, you see the Europeans, and I've written a little bit about this, trying to suck up to Trump. And this is probably not a very good idea, because anyone who sucks up to Trump just earns his disrespect and contempt and will end up being bitten in the end. Again, thank you so much for listening. I'm Borzu Deragahi. I write a newsletter called Badlands. Please subscribe. It's at Borzu, BORZOU.substack.com. Thank you so much.